So who are you and what do you do?
Mitch, my name is Andy McAfee. I am a principal research scientist at MIT, and I write books about where all this technology is taking us, the most recent of which is called The Geek Way.
Yeah, and a big fan of your work. As I
Thank
think
you.
I was trying to tell you, we met a couple times at TED, similar hairstyles. So we've got everything going for us right now. I think it's great.
Yeah. We're on top of things.
We're gone there. Let's talk about geek and geek cultures. You could probably see I'm a bit of a collectible person myself. When I was a geek in high school, it wasn't a term of endearment at all.
No,
It did not bode well for me,
no.
the things I liked. And what I find really interesting about it is the things that I would have been crammed into a locker for are at the apex. I mean, they are the apex predators of culture right now. Whether it's the fact that I was the first one to have a home PC,
Yeah.
whether I was into desktop publishing and printing or modems in the early stage, buying comic books. If you were to
Well, you were all in, weren't you?
yeah. If you were to tell 12-year-old Mitch that there would be a live action X-Men or Doctor Strange movie, not only would I not believe you, but the fact that they would be rocking the box office or
Yeah.
fundamentally have this massive impact on Disney and their stock, I would think that you were on hallucinogenics.
Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about how we went from geek to geek culture?
And you've captured it, because when you and I were starting our journey into geekdom, that word did not improve your social prospects if someone called you a geek. That's kind of a blanket way to think about it. It was not great for, your social standing. And one of the really interesting transitions over the course of our lives, and one of the reasons I decided to grab that word for this book, is that has almost flipped. And now geek is pretty broadly a term of praise or admiration. And to my ears now, it means somebody who can go deep on a problem, who gets properly obsessed, who is tenacious and sticks with it. And there's a second aspect to the meaning, I think, which is that a geek is somebody who, when they come up with solutions to their hard problem, if those solutions are not mainstream, not part of the conventional wisdom, not part of the status quo, they don't care. They're willing to be unconventional. They'll go where their inquiries take them. And I think one turning point in this evolution of the word that I remember was when Tim O'Reilly, the great publisher, technology publisher, great convener of people, said, I try to amplify the signal of the alpha geeks. And I love that. He said, I try to convene the alpha geeks and amplify the weak signals to see where the future is unfolding. So the word has had this kind of broadening, and I think in a really healthy way. And I wanted to grab it to talk about this style of running a company. And I think it's a fair word for me to grab and to describe what's going on, because the people that I got interested in were the people who were building and growing and trying to successfully sustain fairly techie companies in a lot of ways. And a lot of these people were like you and me, man. They have been geeks their entire lives, both in the old sense of the word and in the new broad sense of the word. So I'm writing about the business geeks.
But the business geeks hold with them quite preciously the things that still are aligned with the greater culture. And I think often about how subcultures then permeate to become these mass, interesting people become almost fixated with these things.
Completely.
Think about lineups at Comic-Con. I think like just in general about what this means. In terms of business, that's a bit of a steeper hill to climb, because the perception could be they don't follow what is typically the capitalist type engine. How is it that they are able to do that and transcend that? Because if we think back even to the growth of that market, which let's align to Silicon Valley,
Mhm.
a lot of the initial thinking was so difficult because even the conventional wisdom at pre-IPO would be things like, I'm not trying to make money here. And that was really difficult for people to swallow.
Yeah. And I think once the business geeks got past that, then my answer to your question, how is this way spreading? How does it have a chance to spread? Is the relentless engine of capitalist competition, right? The point I try to make in the book is that I believe the geek way is going to spread because it works better, because it is better at allowing a company to do the things that a company is supposed to do. Turn out offerings that customers value, keep doing that even as the company ages and as it gets bigger. Attract good talent that will want to stick around and contribute their energy and be part of the mission. These are the things that a company needs to do. I believe the Geek Way, it's imperfect, but it's better at achieving those things than the playbook that we came up with during the industrial era. So the reason I think the business geeks are going to successfully keep growing and scaling is that either the competition is going to become geeky or the competition is going to become lesser and more irrelevant.
So let's float a little bit around this word better. What do you
Yeah.
mean by better?
At the risk of repeating myself, better at letting a company get goods and services out the door that customers adore, that satisfy a need in the market, that continue to evolve. The geek companies are very, very good at innovators. Some of the numbers that I looked at strongly indicate that these kinds of companies are simultaneously good at innovation, execution, and agility. So think, for example, about Netflix, which I absolutely call a geek company. Think about SpaceX and Tesla, which think about Amazon, which is a gigantic company now that is still really, really good at innovation, pretty agile, and it takes very, very good care of its customers. These are the kinds of companies, this is the kind of energy that I'm talking about.
It would be difficult not to sit here and say, but Andy, there's a big pushback against this, that we are building these virtual monopolies. Scott Galloway would call them unregulated monopolies, that they become overly dominant, that there is a problem when there's this concentration of this in potentially one geographic region or just overall size. Amazon would be an excellent example that when we talk about regulation, always like regulate what? The e-commerce, the media, the
Right.
cloud business, like what are we talking about regulating? Oh, we're going to just break it all up. What's that going to ultimately do? They'd still dominate in each one of those industries. You would essentially be creating, a five-headed Medusa versus a fire-breathing dragon.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about the fact that there is such a different vibe when we say even the words big tech?
There absolutely is. And I think there are a few reasons for it. But one thing I want to be careful about is substituting monopoly for situation that makes me uncomfortable. And I think there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have the feeling that big tech is too big. It's too powerful. It needs to be reined in more than it currently is. And the really convenient word to reach for to kind of crystallize that unease is, oh, these are monopolies. We have to break them up. We force them to separate it. We have to constrain their activities. By most of the standard economic definitions of the word monopoly, these companies are not monopoly. And if you
Correct.
look at the track record of the FTC at successfully going after these companies for antitrust, for being a monopolies, antitrust violations in court, that track record is not very good so far. And they're sometimes at the level of trying to pursue Amazon in court because Amazon makes it too difficult for you to unsubscribe from being an Amazon Prime customer. Are those the best uses of our executive branches of the investigative resources of of the executive branch? I'm really not sure about that. So I hear a lot of this kind of, to my ears, lazy substitution of the word monopoly for company I don't like, and especially big company that I don't like. And I really want to be careful about that. I appreciate that big, powerful companies make people uneasy. Absolutely. And I believe that all great concentrations of power demand vigilance. I absolutely believe that these companies are very big, very influential. They're deeply ingrained in our lives and our societies, and they deserve a lot of scrutiny. To me, that's very, very different from saying that they deserve to be broken up. And the question that I'm really trying to pose in the book is, how did they get so big? No one handed them these gigantic markets. They typically were going into places where there was already a lot of competition. It's not like Amazon was the first commerce or e-commerce company. And the riddle that I'm trying to get to the bottom is what allowed them to go into these incumbent heavy industries and mop the floor with the incumbents. I don't think that's an antitrust story.
But it might be a capital story. It could be the fact that you have a modicum of success, you start acquiring, growing at scale. You start investing when other businesses wouldn't typically play that game because they're looking at other things like the actual P&L. There was and is this fervency over, I mean, look, you don't have to look any further than WeWork, right? If we look at WeWork, we could probably have a very logical conversation or debate about the fact that a $49 billion valuation didn't come because it was a real estate portfolio. It came because of their positioning as a tech company. And that ultimately, when the market, which is vicious, decided that it is in fact a real estate company, we have situations like this.
Yeah, speculative bubbles happen in capitalist societies.
Yeah.
This is not the first one that we've seen. The word WeWork does not appear in my book. By no stretch of the imagination would I call WeWork a geek company, because what I'm trying to do is walk away from the labels tech or Silicon Valley, because I think they're distractions from the real phenomenon. The point that I'm trying to make in the Geek Way is that a bunch of geeks concentrated in Northern California, concentrated in high-tech industries, have experimented and iterated their way into a better set of philosophies and practices for running a company. WeWork, to me, is no part of that story. They had a typical visionary autocratic leader deciding things on the fly, snowing everybody that he came across. That might be some kind of archetypal Silicon Valley narrative in some ways. To me, it's not a geek story at all.
Yeah. Well, when you think about how things evolve, what are you seeing? When I think about the work you did with the second machine age,
Yeah.
I would argue automation, robotics. This was where we were thinking.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's, I think that that's still on the horizon. It's just, it's an inevitable. It will be here. When I think about artificial intelligence and how things are rolling out there, do we put ourselves in a place where the geek way becomes this new form of capitalism? We used the word better, and we talked a little bit about the economy and economics of scale. Is that just the reality that the people who are tinkering with the edge of technology are essentially creating what is this new economy? And woe is the organization that can't keep up?
Yeah. And I'm going to continue, Mitch, to use the word better, because I think that's the right word to use when a company is able to satisfy customers more, when a company is able to provide a good work environment for people and to be very, very attractive. And we can certainly talk about whether the stereotype of Silicon Valley as this modern day sweatshop of, of miserable cubicle dwellers is accurate. You preview, I don't think it is. But I am going to continue to use the word better for this phenomenon that I'm studying. And you bring up the point that I've written a few books and co-written with Eric Brynjolfsson a couple other books about the phrase that I would use is technology's impact on X. And X has changed in the books that I've written.
Yeah.
And what's going on now, I think, is that I'm concentrating on the first part of that phrase, because I've written about digital technologies and social technologies, lots of robotics, self-driving cars. And I think I'm still writing about a technology in this book, although there's no discussion of robotics, AI, generative AI, machine learning. That's almost absent from the book. The technology that I'm writing about in this book is the company. And it sounds like I'm trying to play cute language games, but I don't think I am. In the geek way, I make the argument that the company is a technology. The company is a thing that we human beings have invented to help us accomplish our goals. That's a pretty tight definition of a technology. My point is that in the geek way is that technology has received an upgrade. And that upgrade has come from the same part of the world that our operating system upgrades come out of. But let's concentrate on that upgrade to the technology that is the company and understand why it's better and how it provides advantage out there in the world.
So let's talk about where we're at now in the world, which is, I always use the word post-pandemic, and then I worry that people will think this was recorded in like 2022 or something. Because, but the impact of that moment on work, in particular with technology, we can't diminish. We can't just dismiss it. And I would even make the argument that as of the date we're recording this, the idea of return to office, what business looks like, has changed. When I do my keynote presentations, I'll talk about disruption as the big bad wolf in business and then remind the audience that I was saying this for about 10 years prior to the pandemic. but we have this fog that sits with us that makes us feel or believe that the real digital transformations that we saw happened because of the pandemic. Can you play a little bit around with this idea? How are companies behaving? Are companies predominantly more along the lines of the geek way because of the results of this?
I don't think so. And maybe in one important way, we're in danger of walking away from one element of the geek way. And I want to come back to that. The pandemic certainly accelerated our use of digital technologies. And now we're trying to figure out what flavor of remote, hybrid, in person, how we're going to balance all of that. I'm not sure about, what I don't think happened is that the pandemic and the aftermath accelerated the transition to the kinds of practices that I talk about in the book. And to preview a little bit what's in the book, I talk mainly about the geek way consisting of four things, four norms, four expected behaviors: science, making decisions and arguing based on evidence; speed, iterating with feedback instead of planning a bunch; ownership, devolving authority and responsibility down to an uncomfortable level and then trying to ensure alignment; and then openness, being receptive to feedback, even if it comes from lower down in the org chart, trying to create psychological safety and avoid defensiveness, and being willing to pivot. So to me, the geek way is about speed, science, ownership, and openness. And I can't tell a tidy story about how the pandemic helped with all of that. The question I think that we're going to grapple with for some time to come is, how in person do the people in our organizations need to be? And I think that's a key issue, because the science that underlies the book and underlies my claims for the geek way is the science that looks at us human beings and says, wait a minute, we are weird. There's nothing else like us on the planet, nothing even close. To make that concrete, just realize we are the only species on the planet that's launching spaceships. And outside of sci-fi, we don't expect any other species. The
To be fair, Andy, there's probably only 5 of us that are doing that, though. Out of 8 billion people.
No, there are a whole lot of rocket launchers out there. There are 0 chimpanzee, octopus, or ant rocket launchers, and we don't expect that to happen. So there's this discipline called cultural evolution that looks at that phenomenon and says, wait a minute, how are we the only species that does that? And one of their huge conclusions is that what makes us humans super weird, so unique on the planet, is that we both cooperate intensely with non-kin, and we are intensely self-interested. That intersection of the Venn diagram is kind of us and kind of nothing else. Because we're such a social cooperative species, it's unclear to me how much we need to be physically close to each other for the magic of spaceship building and spaceship launching to happen. We're going to get an answer to that as we emerge from the pandemic, but I think we are not really well wired to just look at screens and collaborate with each other all the time.
Yeah, I'm wondering what brings us to this thought. Is it the fact that we had so much of the population do it from home? Because if we think about the world prior to this, the companies that we are raving to be along the geek way were the ones that were taking up a whole lot of physical real estate, that were doing very unique things within that real estate, and are right now trying to figure out, what do we do with that real estate?
Yeah, exactly. And that is a huge open question. And I am not saying that we all need to go back to the industrial era conception of a work week where we drag ourselves to some big city office space, 40 hours a week. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that I'm pretty sure that we are still a in-person species to some extent, and we need to find ways to bring us together and get the learning to happen, get the socialization to happen, get the trust to happen, get the bonds to form. All these things that allow our species to do what it does. Some of those things are very proximity based mechanisms, and we're going to have to figure them out.
It's a tough debate to have. I often think about the fact that I'll assume companies like Alphabet and Meta and Amazon have really good data analytics and usage of what's happening internally, that they're probably, or for no reason would release to the public. There's no reason to do that. And they are certainly making demands. Clearly, they're seeing something within this information. And yet, humans being who they are, self-interested, but also collaborating really good, are in some way, shape, or form trying to argue against that. It's an interesting place.
I think that's a nice microcosm of this phenomenon that I'm talking about, where we are intensely cooperative, but a lot of us got used to working from home. Commuting is no fun at all. It makes family uh, situations and childcare a lot easier. So there is this tension between organizations which have usually looked at the data and they want at least some level of in-person activities, and the individuals involved who are kind of like, I want a little bit less than that. That's a tough tension. More generally, we should always expect that these kinds of tensions are going to crop up again, because we human beings are so weird. We really are. We're the most cooperative, pro-social species on the planet, and like everything else that has genes, we want to propagate our genes. It's another way of saying that we have a great deal of self-interest. I think part of the hard work of leadership is always balancing those two things. I think with the Geek Way, what I'm trying to do is frame that issue a little bit differently. For example, this tension really helps me understand the default of crazy bureaucratization that happens inside most companies as they age. Most companies wind up with these weirdly elaborate Byzantine bureaucracies that make people pretty miserable. If you showed what was actually happening inside the company to the CEO, that what you usually get a response like one of the ones I put in the book, where somebody actually showed the CEO of a company the process flow, what actually happens to get something done. And Mitch, can I swear on the show?
Please.
He said he looked at this, not the idealized process flow chart, but the real one. And he said, this is even more fucked up than I imagined. So I think the ultimate reason for all this weirdness and all this bureaucracy is that we humans crave status. It's part of being a social species, and we invent work and we invent approval loops. We want to get in on them, and it's got to go past our office or past my desk to get approved. And over time, that very natural, very human hunger for status metastasizes into this kind of sprawling, sclerotic bureaucracy that we make fun of on TV. But when you go look at a lot of companies, especially larger, older ones, you see it in practice. And trying very hard not to let that waste accrue, trying not to let those barnacles accrue, is part of what geek leaders do. I remember in one of Brad Stone's books about Amazon, he was making the case that by about the mid-teens, Bezos's main job was trying to fight that constantly encroaching bureaucracy inside Amazon.
Yeah, and how did we do, right?
And it's still there. I was reading, as I was finishing up the manuscript, I was reading about Andy Jassy, Bezos' successor, fighting back this increasing bureaucratization, processification of a lot of work at Amazon. That's not the original Amazon way. But as they staffed up so heavily in the early chapters of the pandemic, they brought in a huge number of people who were used to following the playbook of the industrial era. And I had colleagues who worked at Amazon at the time, and they said, watch out. This is going to be a real clash of cultures. And to preserve what's really special about this company, because they have tried super hard to devolve authority, to really have two pizza teams and single-threaded leaders and a modular technology architecture that led to AWS, they tried very hard to build and preserve that. And now here comes a clash, because there's a huge number of people who have grown up, built their careers following a very different playbook. This stuff is not easy.
No, and often when you bring in new types of industry, media would be a great example. When I understand my pedigree, you would anticipate the bureaucracy of what media has to play, because they know that formula.
Yeah.
And trying to integrate it with the Amazon formula makes it absurd. To me, it felt very definitive that Amazon.com was very different from the people who were working at AWS. AWS felt more like you could grab someone from Salesforce than you could from Walmart.com.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's probably true. But from the jump, or from very early in its history, Amazon has taken this idea of ownership very, very seriously. I think it's the first of their current leadership principles, and worked really hard to do something that I find fascinating. Mitch, I started my research and then my teaching career last century. And you remember in the mid 90s how fond we were of business process reengineering and defining all the cross-functional touch points and all the coordination and communication that needed to happen to make the organization all play from the same sheet of music. And the business geeks looked at it and they go, yuck. That is just a recipe for sclerosis. That is a recipe for ever more bureaucracy and infighting and not getting anything done, and handicapping and even kneecapping the innovators and the builders in the organization. So Amazon took the lead, and other geek companies have done the same thing. They said, man, we are going to try to reduce the amount of cross-functional coordination, of communication that happens, of all this kind of horizontal stuff that we built up over the industrial era. The geeks said, that's actually a bad idea. That's not a good idea. There's a great quote from the book Working Backward about some of the early days of Amazon. And they quote Bezos as saying, if we want a place where to be a place where the builders can build, we have to cut down on the communication. That is like a 180-degree flip from what I used to think was the right approach for running a company.
Yeah, I guess where I find myself thinking about this really deeply is this idea of the geek leader. When I think of who these leaders are and what they act like, they align very well with what I read in the Geek Way.
Mm.
But at the same time, they're very anachromatic. They're not necessarily people that get along great with other people. They're not necessarily people that are team builders, that are vocal, that are excellent communicators at an idea or a vision. When we see someone like Bezos, who I've had the chance to meet and talk a little bit to at places like TED, my instinct was he's got that part of it, but he also very much has the skill set that's missing from a lot of these quote unquote leaders as we would anticipate them to be.
Yeah.
Can you circle that square for me that we have these leaders that are so, Steve Jobs was known to be so oppositional, for as an example.
Yeah.
What is it?
We can be polite, right? Jobs was a massive jerk in a lot of ways. That's pretty clear from what we know about him. Isaacson's biography makes that really clear.
Elon too.
You mean
more and more?
That's kind of center square on the bingo card these days, right?
Yeah.
But so there are a couple really interesting things going on, and we're going to need to unpack this going forward. But I'm with you. A lot of the people that I'm talking about, and a lot of people that I've had the chance to interview and learn from, I forget what the exact phrase we're supposed to use these days is. I'll go with neuroatypical.
Somewhere on the spectrum.
So I'm not sure if that's the thing. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I think your listeners will know what we're talking about. They tend to be kind of classic computer geeky kinds of people. Are stereotypically low on EQ, stereotypically kind of introverted. And as you know, there is more than a grain of truth to that stereotype. However, one of the things that I think has been going on, one of the things that I think is fundamental, is that these geeks, they did what geeks do. They looked at the hard problem of how do I want to run this company well. I've poured myself into this company that I've founded and that I'm trying to build. How do I do that? And how do I avoid the mistakes that I see cropping up and these dysfunctions that keep cropping in? And they kind of, instead of thinking about, their fellow human beings, I think maybe they looked at us as this interesting species over here, and like an alien anthropologist landing, and said, how do I get this species to do more of the things that I want? And so, for example, they said, okay, this species looks like it likes to communicate a lot. And the tendency there is that they might make work so that they can be part of it. I have to stop that. So I think one of the counterintuitive things that is going on is that these neuroatypical people have looked more deeply into us as a species and found some better ways to bring us together. Now, there are a couple huge exceptions here. One is, as you have pointed out, too many geeks enjoy screaming at their underlings and hurling insults about how stupid people are. You brought up Jobs. I bring up the case of Linus Torvalds in the book, who did this amazing thing. He brought Linux into the world, right? Created this worldwide community. And in the discussion boards, he would flame people all day, every day, gleefully. And when he got called out on it, he would double down on it, to the point that he drove very talented people away. And he eventually had to leave the position when his behavior became unignorable by anybody. That's a terrible outcome, right? You want somebody that competent and that influential to be part of the thing that they created. But this geek failure mode of starting every sentence with, that's the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard. Man, if we want the business geeks to be successful, they have to train themselves out of that particular failure mode. Another one, let me say one more. This is not particular to the business geeks, but they're not immune from it either, is just good old-fashioned overconfidence. It's been called the most pernicious human bias. It's probably the easiest one to elicit. We human beings are chronically overconfident. Again, I'll go back to this discipline of cultural evolution, that their explanation for why we're overconfident is that confidence is a really good thing for a social creature to have. So we're programmed by evolution to be more confident than is actually warranted. That applies to all of us. And we certainly see that when leaders have this amazing track record of success and they become convinced of their next big idea and how good it is, if there aren't real checks on them, and if they're not self-aware and humble enough to go seek out those checks or actually listen to countervailing points of view and contrary evidence, then we wind up with Zuckerberg spending, I forget how many tens of billions of dollars on the metaverse before tacitly walking away from it. We see Elon buying whatever we're supposed to call Twitter now and just destroying crazy amounts of value with that. The geeks are like the rest of us. They are not immune from overconfidence. And if they escape from the checks and balances they've tried to put on overconfidence in their organizations, they're in trouble.
We talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion. It's interesting to me that we will default to cis white males when we talk about these people. Have you thought about that? Why is that? What is happening with attitudinal, who we are? It's not exclusive. I by no means want to say that, but there is a majority there.
And there absolutely is. And Bloomberg did a pretty good analysis a while back. It appears that the tech industries are even more white and male in their management and in their executive ranks than most other industries, at least in America. The phenomenon that you identify is a real phenomenon. And my answer to your excellent question of what's going on is I honestly don't know. The simplest explanation is that we're such inherent pattern matchers that if a bunch of nerdy STEM flavored white guys are running a company or allocating capital or investing in companies, they tend to pattern match and like all the rest of us in a fairly unreflective way, and they might just keep letting more white guys into the club. But I want to be clear, I don't know what's going on. I think it's a problem for a bunch of reasons. It's not great if you have this much of an outlier, very important industry in a pluralistic society. I also have trouble believing that we are optimally allocating the capital and the opportunities in the tech space. Can it really be the case that people of color and women have that smaller percentage of the world changing ideas out there? I don't know anybody that believes that. But again, to repeat my answer, I don't exactly know what's going on.
Yeah. And I want to take it in another direction, but similar is, are you seeing the geek way outside of tech? Is it anytime we see innovation? I'm thinking about leaders like, or businesses like Trader Joe's or Patagonia, or I was even thinking a lot about, as I was reading the book, Dana White from the UFC, who would probably be the complete opposite of this characteristic type, but tremendously innovative and would, if you looked at how they operate, probably hit maybe 3 or 4 even of the 4 norms there. Where does it isolate itself?
And I haven't taken my research on the road to try to answer your question in any kind of systematic way. I think it's really important homework to do, but I'm with you. These norms, speed, science, ownership, and openness, they exist out all over the economy. They exist to more or lesser degrees, and they can be found. You can find 2 or 3 of them, maybe even all 4, in lots of organizations and lots of industries. But I want to give you a concrete example, which some people might think is a dodge, but I don't think it is.
I want to talk about that.
Okay, great. I want to talk about the space industry. The space industry is not a classic Silicon Valley industry. It is not. You would not have called it high tech. You would have put it in a different category.
Government industrial, would that be?
Yeah, the government industrial complex, and the space industry is a capital intensive, knowledge intensive, oligopolistic. There's a small number of companies that have been divvying up the very large pie for a long time. And a very stable industry for a long time, for just about the entire history of the space industry. The story has been one of consolidation. And along comes this company, SpaceX, founded in the 21st century. This company is 22 years old from its founding. And it's an incredibly geeky company in most of the ways that I describe in the book. I want to go through very, very quickly what SpaceX has been able to accomplish in its short life, coming into an industry that already had all the things that we've talked about. Number one, they're the only organization that has successfully built commercially viable reusable rockets, and they've relaunched more than 100 times. I looked it up. SpaceX launched 80% of the satellites that left Earth's orbit in 2022 and 60% of the weight that left Earth's orbit in 2022. This is absolute dominance in an industry that they didn't exist in the year 2000. Number two, as far as I'm aware, they're the only organization on the planet that could deploy rugged, portable, high bandwidth satellite internet terminals in the thousands into Ukraine after Russia invaded. And number three, they're the only American organization that has a capsule that is certified by NASA to take human beings into space. SpaceX got their contract to build that at about the same time that Boeing did. Boeing's contract was 40% bigger. SpaceX has completed somewhere on the order of 10 missions for NASA with astronauts going up. Boeing has yet to do its first crewed test of a capsule. So I look at that and I want to make sure that we don't make the lazy mistake of saying, "Oh, well, SpaceX is a high tech company." No, SpaceX is, like you say, the government industrial space manufacturing industry. But they have absolutely come to dominate that industry in about 20 years, and it makes me wonder two things: A, how they do it. That's why I wrote the book. But B, what have the incumbents in this industry been doing? How have we been so badly underserved by these incumbents in this industry now that we know what's actually possible? And the thing that makes me optimistic is we're going to see this phenomenon happen in more and more industries going forward. Some geek is going to show up with their handbook that looks, I hope, something like what I write about in the Geek Way, and they're going to start quickly mopping the floor with incumbents in industry after industry. I'll take that bet all day long.
But is it because, in fact, they are transforming it to for profit tech? I think about the fact that at the time SpaceX came out, the industry was primarily on its heels. There wasn't investment in that. The world had changed. Somebody comes along with an expertise in digital technology and understands if I can apply that and put a level of commercialism on it, it might work, much in the same way Tesla did with the automotive industry. And we could look at other examples of that as well. You could even look at things like Uber and someone saying, when I layer technology onto this and add the Geek Way, suddenly I'm reinventing the industry.
Okay, but hold on. What magic layer of tech did Elon layer on top of the space industry in the early 2000s? That story doesn't make a ton of sense to me, nor is it the case that Elon's the only person out there with a profit motive. The space industry is dominated, except for NASA, one big government organization. But the space industry is full of hopefully profit-seeking companies. The global auto industry is entirely full of profit-oriented companies. Now, Elon had strong incentives, but if that were the answer, then we would have seen the disruption happen a lot sooner.
Yeah, I wonder. I just think about the layer of adding in thinking like that, where it is that, to use a bad quote, move fast and break things.
Yeah.
An ideology of the right people who are thinking about commercialization, who are just injecting the culture of the Geek Way, which I do think part of the answer that gets them to that place of speed, openness, ownership science is an advantage of technology. It's an advantage that we can build layers on top of this to make it more efficient.
Yeah, I'm still pushing back because I don't want to make this too much about any particular technology
Right.
toolkit. I'm with you with something you said a tiny bit earlier. This mindset. Now we're on the same page,
Right.
right? And Elon and SpaceX and lots of other new companies in the space industry are not only willing, but they can't imagine doing it any other way than moving fast and being willing to break things, being willing to have a rocket blow up on a launch pad or after liftoff, as long as there are no human lives involved. Being willing to do experiments that will fail as long as you're learning something from it. So what I think core to the Geek Way is walking away from this very planning heavy, analysis heavy, upfront loaded process for trying to do something very difficult and moving into a mode of let's do the minimum amount of planning that we need to do, and then let's start iterating with good feedback, because that is actually how you learn to improve rapidly. You don't improve while you're sitting around just drawing up ever more elaborate plans. You succeed in kidding yourself, but I don't think you succeed in actually learning and building things.
So we see these people do this exceptionally well, whether it's startup attitude, geek way attitude. How do you feel incumbents are doing? Can they adapt? What does that look like to you?
I think they can, because my point in the book, in the Geek Way, is there's nothing magic going on here. It's difficult, but it's not magic. You don't need to have 60% comp sci PhDs. You don't need to have the relevant patents. You don't need any glitter. You just need to be willing to do things fairly differently. So when I think about the future, I have seen at one company that I would call a bureaucratic, sclerotic, yesterday's news incumbent come back in a roaring way. And that's Microsoft. And I had the chance to interview Satya Nadella for the book. And the amount of value that he has created since he took over in 2014 at Microsoft is staggering. The amount of energy that he unlocked at that company. And it's easy to forget, you and I were around, but it's easy to forget how dead in the water Microsoft was in the first decade of the 21st century,
Yeah.
right? Their stock price was going nowhere. It was flat as a pancake. They were great at killing innovation. They were a large, profitable company, but they were profoundly uninteresting. Investors weren't interested in them. Customers just kept buying their license. They were just and when you looked internally, they were clearly a sclerotic bureaucracy, terrible political infighting. All this was pretty well documented. And Nadella comes in, and in less than a decade, he has created that kind of value and turned the situation around. And as I was interviewing him, trying to listen carefully and learn, I kept on hearing myself check off the things that are on the Geek Way checklist. He talked about embracing agile approaches and embracing the norm of speed. He talked about evidence-based decision making, but some of the most interesting stuff that he talked about was the work that he did to make Microsoft a less inherently defensive organization. Microsoft is a classic win at all costs, never admit weakness, never show. It's like Jack Welch's autobiography called Winning, and just a classic description of an inherently defensive organization, where the best way for you to not succeed or for you to fall behind was to ever show that you were wrong or that you needed to pivot or that somebody else had a better idea. That was Microsoft. And one of the things that Nadella, I think, has been brilliant at is discouraging that kind of inherently defensive mindset and making it a more open company. And he talks in his book, and he talked with me about some of the techniques that he used to do that. But one of the most important is that he just leads by example, as all leaders should. And he's so clearly not an inherently, a bulldog kind of a personality. He's an open, engaged, thoughtful person. That kind of stuff permeates.
Yeah. It's interesting too when you lay it against somebody like Tim Cook, who, if you look at his tenure, 12, 13 years post Steve Jobs, numbers are also staggering. Different,
Staggering.
but staggering.
Yeah, staggering. And I would love to interview Steve Cook. I have not had the chance. Cook, yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you. Steve would be great too. I haven't had a chance to interview Tim. I would love that. And Apple, it's super interesting. It's more of a closed shop than most of the other big tech companies. So I don't feel like I know as much about it. But their mania for secrecy is interesting because at first you think, well, that's not very geek. And then I started to think, actually it is. To the point, the conversation that we were having earlier, the geeks are actually not that fond of huge amounts of collaboration, coordination. Fine, that secrecy might actually let the teams get their work done without a whole lot of, hey, would you run that up the flagpole, hey, let's just have a check-in meeting about all this. I think that secrecy might come in handy. They are fanatics internally about an agile approach, about an iterative approach to things. And I heard a great story about how when they were trying to figure out if when you take a portrait of somebody, it's got that cool blurry background, if the user should have the ability to preview the blur before they take the picture or only look at it afterward. There was a debate inside Apple about that until somebody from the human interface team gave a demo in a conference room that showed how cool the preview the blur feature was. And then the room was like, oh, well, to me, that's science at work. Science is an evidence-based argument or debate about what we should do. And that person showed evidence in a room and it kind of ended the debate. So we think about science as this thing that needs, beakers and A/B tests and fancy statistics. No, it's just an evidence-based argument.
Is it an evidence-based argument as much as it is an iterative-based decision? The
That's
fact that
that
we're doing lots of experiments,
Yeah.
many, many failures. In fact, even with our resolute decision that the filter comes before or after in
Yeah.
6 months, it may not because culture changes.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's exactly right. And that's what I was trying to get at with the argument part. I read a wonderful book that really solidified this view in my head called The Knowledge Machine by Michael Strevens, a philosopher. And he said, look, science is an endless argument for all the reasons that you identified. It's governed by a norm. It's governed by an iron law of how we're going to conduct this argument. And the iron law, the norm in science is it ain't your fancy job title. It's not your charisma. It's not the fancy university you work at. It's not your brilliant PowerPoint. It's, man, you better bring your evidence. You bring what you have. I bring what I have. We're going to duke it out in a fairly transparent, visible way. And the heart of it is if you believe A and I believe B, let's figure out the test that will distinguish between the two. Now, I was just trying to be clever, do an A-B test, but that's what's at the heart of science.
There's another thing happening here, which is this isn't about commoditization or pricing or geography and region. What we are talking about with a lot of these organizations is a wicked problem that nobody else is willing to solve. What
Yes.
factor does that play in the Geek Way versus bringing a Geek Way leader into Walmart, tapping them on the shoulder and going, go for it?
I love that question. I don't know because we absolutely see at most, if not all of these companies, some combination of a visionary and a huge vision. And we'll talk about Elon again. He has rallied people around making human beings an interplanetary species and stop getting us out of the work of cooking the planet via electric vehicles. That is absolutely true. Steve Jobs was a visionary. He had no trouble drawing people to his cause. I don't think that's essential. I really don't. I think we're going to see geeks take over, I don't know, convenience stores. And the leader of that company will probably articulate a compelling vision, but come on, it's a convenience store.
Well, Amazon and Tesla are both trying that, aren't they?
Yeah, well, yeah, and getting us to the stuff we want quicker and better and cheaper. Like, sign me up for that vision, but it's not in the same league as going to Mars, right? So I don't think, to your question, I don't think a go to Mars level vision is necessary for the Geek Way. I think we're going to see it creep into all kinds of prosaic industries. I think there's going to be a SpaceX of white goods, of refrigerators and things like that. And I can't wait to see what kind of fridge they come up with because I can't envision something radically different than what I have right now, but somebody out there can.
Different type of cold box.
Yeah,
Let's
right.
talk about artificial intelligence. It's an interesting time to have this conversation, and I respect your thinking and opinions on this, which is why I'm curious. There's one camp that would say things like what the steam engine was to the world before, what the printing press was to the world before, what the internet was to the world before. And I've been through some of these transitions, in particular computers and then to internet and beyond. I feel, in my work at least, that AI is so fundamentally different than this type of shift that it might be paramount to us even questioning one of your earlier statements, which is we are such a unique species, there's nobody else like us. Where are you on this? We'll call this a spectrum because we have really smart people who are neck deep in this, who will sit on one side of talking about it being a very nice interface with a very boring underbody, to other people talking about it's already basically at the precipice of what they call AGI or artificial general intelligence. What are you thinking about this?
So I want to make sure that I've got your spectrum in my mind correctly. At one end is the steam engine, and at the other end is a humanity transforming or threatening thing.
This is a shift in a before and after moment, a scale of which we could never have imagined.
To be fair, though, that actually applies to the steam engine. And as you probably know,
100%. But I'm saying even at a scale greater than that, where we're questioning our own ability of what intelligence is, of what knowledge is, of what we do even.
I think some of that will happen. I think this is an incredibly powerful tool. I'm still more in the first camp that you identified. I put this in the basket with the steam engine and electrification and internal combustion as a general purpose technology that is going to accelerate the normal march of economic progress, I think it's probably uh, in that very, very small bundle. And like you say, it's going to have some weird effects because we've never before had, what do you want to call it? This phrase artificial intelligence just freaks so many people out. You want to call it a peer, another entity that can look at really hard problems and come up with
It's
solutions.
like an equal opportunity intelligence. I don't know.
Yeah, let's take that word. That word intelligence just gets
Yeah.
us into so many
Or knowledge
now,
or
I don't know.
capabilities or I
How
don't
about
know.
problem solving? We've got
Okay.
another problem solver out there, and it has recently demonstrated its ability to understand to understand human language at a bizarrely high level. Man, this is fascinating. I appreciate that it's unsettling for a lot of people, but I'm not one of those folk who spends many cycles worrying about the Terminator, the singularity, superintelligence, alignment, or even how are we going to define AGI and what happens when we get there. Those are those debates are fascinating to a lot of people I respect a great deal. I think I'm just a bit more prosaic than that. I'm excited about another problem solver on the planet, and I'm excited about what happens when we take this super powerful toolkit and we democratize it. We give it to more creators and builders and innovators out there all over the world. I am not worried that one of them is going to build the Terminator. I'm not even that worried that they're going to use it to try to build bioweapons. We already have bioweapons as a lurking danger. Uh, I I don't I don't want that to be a reason not to pursue this tool with great enthusiasm. The history of human beings and very powerful technologies is to me an encouraging history and one of us muddling through and kind of getting it right. I think that pattern is going to repeat itself.
I'll put the pros forward that has made me rethink that because I was where you were.
Mhm.
And then when this analogy came into play, I started thinking differently about this. Yuval Noah Harari makes the argument that pre-Holocaust Germany starts seeing unemployment in the 25 plus percentage. That's a festering water for hate, extremism, etc. It leads us down this terrible path that we've all now experienced. And that it's not so much that we can get through this. The general sentiment is we do. We're good as humans. We typically get through it. It's the time of when it starts to when we get through it that's very, very terrifying. And that if this attacks even 10% of this workforce, that it could be extremely problematic for society. One would be that would be one conversation point. I do look at it that way and then think about the fact that you can have a really advanced school degree and be very senior in some type of organization with decades of success. And fundamentally, your job day in and day out is quite repetitive. And if it is, that's the type of stuff this thing likes to eat. So I then will put on, as the third case, my creative artistic hat, where I'd say, hey, you have two bands. One of them is U2, one of them is not. They both can play, they both can jam, they both sound really, really good, but one is U2 and one is not. Why? They both have guitars, they both have bass, drums, singers, all that stuff. There's this 5% that we can't equate for. There's this magic, the soul of something. Those are my three thoughts that lead me in a bit of a different path than I'm worried about AGI or it becoming, botnet or whatever.
Let me start off by finding common ground, and then I think I'm going to depart a bit. Uh, I agree with you that when very powerful, when big changes happen to societies that are already polarizing, that can go really badly. And unfortunately, our societies, America and lots of other societies in the world, are pretty clearly polarizing. We're talking past each other. Trust is going down. Middle ground is going down. We could have an endless discussion about why that is, but I think the fact is impossible to argue with. Uh, if there's a big employment dislocation, that would probably not make the situation better. That would probably not bring us
Right.
all back together. Nothing else has so
The
far.
pandemic didn't, so yeah.
The pandemic did. We all started yelling at each other about wearing masks and taking vaccines and stuff. We're just in this bad place, and I agree with that. And that's the thing that worries the hell out of me. The other agreement, that I have with you is that this technology is going to confront some job holders. And confront is a polite word for make them nervous or put some of them out of work. I don't think I'd want to be a professional stock photographer right now, given how good image generating technologies are. But you bring up somebody who's very, very educated and does a repetitive job. That kind of describes a radiologist. And when the first wave of very powerful machine learning came out about 11 years ago, a lot of people, myself included a little bit, started to say, well, we're not going to need very many radiologists or nearly as many radiologists anymore. That was dead flat wrong. That was wrong. And what we got wrong, and I got this wrong, was to appreciate that a job is a bunch of tasks. And if suddenly 30% of your tasks are better done by a piece of technology, that does not mean that you do not get to conclude from that, if you're being thoughtful at all, that you need 30% fewer of those people. It depends on a lot of other stuff. And so even if we grant, and I fully grant, that generative AI is going to take over an unknown percentage, but probably more than a couple percent of the tasks that are currently done in our workforce, to me, it really doesn't automatically follow that we're going to need fewer management consultants or accountants or legal analysts or any of that stuff. Maybe we will, but that's not the immediate conclusion to draw. So I'm a lot less confident than Harari and a lot of other people are that, oh my heavens, this is going to put 25% of the workforce out of work, and all kinds of societal strife is going to follow immediately from that. You can go back and find people saying that about just about every previous powerful technology. I don't want to join that litany anymore because I don't think it's a thoughtful analysis.
When I was thinking about what you were saying, I was thinking about also how it ties into the Geek Way very much, that the simplicity of my brain would go to this idea that we've been very, very effective at critical thinking. And perhaps our way through this is the marriage of that with more emergent thinking. That emergent thinking is really the secret sauce a little bit here. This ability to play with something without necessarily knowing what it is, without having this finite prioritization of how it is and how you're going to capitalize it. We're going to
Amen.
play with it to see what it is. And then from that, we will get outcomes.
Think how I love it. Think how ideally suited generative AI is for the Geek Way, which is all about iterating, getting feedback, and going back for the next iteration. If you try to plot your organization's 5-year generative AI plan out right now and then slavishly follow it, holy cow, are you a dinosaur of the industrial era? Like that is just, I guarantee you that is not going to work. Now, you do need a minimum viable plan. And I believe that so strongly, along with Eric and a couple other people. I've co-founded a company to help the enterprise come up with their Gen AI plan. You need a minimum viable plan. After that, man, the way to learn about this particular technology, given how new it is, given how weird it is, given you how emergent it is, I love your word, the only way you're going to get good at this is by iterating with it and figuring out how you continue to be valuable out there to a customer, to an employer out there in the workforce in a world of very powerful generative AI. I'll say it again. I don't think for a second, if you're a thoughtful and empathetic or creative or a person, that this technology spells economic doom for you. I believe exactly the opposite. But the only way you're going to get there is by jumping in and trying it and learning and trying again.
Yeah, for sure. Tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I love this question. I have been kind of a button down, straight arrow person for most of my life. And just kind of cautious or worried about making a fool out of myself or worried about X, Y, and Z for a lot of my life. And one moment where that really changed for me was when I was going to be on stage at some conference with a couple people, including Yo-Yo Ma. Long story, but all of us were in the green room, and we're going to be on stage in downtown Boston. It was kind of a big room, and we were nervous. The panelists were kind of nervous backstage, and you could feel it. And then Yo-Yo walks in, and he's authentically loose and funny and cracking jokes and not the least bit concerned. And he put us all at ease, and we all became Yo-Yo Ma fans at that point in time. He was amazing. And at some point, I found myself over in a corner of the room with him, and I said, "Hey, I have to ask, have you always been this loose and kind of, free flowing before you go on stage?" He said, "Oh my heavens, no." He was a child prodigy, spent his entire life performing, and he said, "I used to be so concerned before I would go on stage and obsessed with giving a good performance, and I'd be a bundle of stress and anxiety before I went on stage." And I said, "What changed?" And he just looked at me and he said, "How much good have your hangups done you?" And I just thought, wow, wow.
Oh,
Thank you. That's always stuck with me. And now if I find myself getting inherently, kind of, oh, I don't think I want to do that, then I'm able to say to myself, how much good have your hangups done you? And that changes the default to yes, not all the time, but more of the time than it used to.
oh, that's a great one, Andy. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
The new book is called The Geek Way. I was a massive fan of the second Machine Age as well as Machine Platform Crowd. You've got another book called More from Less, Rage
Yep.
Against, I was going to say Rage Against the Machine because that's my music guy, but it's Race Against the Machine.
Yep.
Tell people where they can find out more about you, the book, and also in general type of content you're creating online and sharing.
I am a McAfee on Twitter. That's where I currently barf out most of my ideas. AMCAF like Frank EE. You can buy The Geek Way. It's out. You can buy it wherever books are sold. And I have a website, andrewmcafee.org. But one of my near-term plans is to spin up a Substack and use that platform as a
Correct.
way to just kind of get ideas out as they're happening. No promises. I don't know when it's going to start. I don't know if it's going to be any good, but that's where I think I'm going to try to carry these ideas forward, in addition to the other kinds of writing. And stay tuned. I think there's a good to excellent chance that Eric and I are going to get the band together again
Oh,
before
good.
too long. Yeah,
Good, good. And I'll be the
it's been too
first.
it's been
I'll,
too long.
I'll be the first subscriber on that Substack, Andy. Thank you so much for your time.
Mitch, thank you. It's been a blast.